side of the hall. Seem to be sitting where you sit it now. I'm in the information security space. Look at these type of things every day. Lots of fun and games. Sometimes you get quite, say, just blasé about these things, but there's quite a lot of interesting things that's happening in this space. But tonight's talk is just going to be more or less an overview of the last 12 months, plus minus, and just so that we can remind ourselves what roller coaster ride we went through. It was quite an interesting time, and we're actually coming up to a lot of anniversaries for a lot of interesting things now, and we'll go and visit that. But also, please participate. If you don't agree with anything I say, if you think I'm off my rocker, put up your hand. Let's talk about it. I want to learn from you guys as well. I want to hear your opinions as well. I'm not an expert. This is just a topic that we can talk, and I'm just leading our thought process here. And yeah, like I said, there's a lot that you probably exposed to, that you know about, that can shed insight into what we're discussing here. But also, what we're going to do basically tonight is going to cover some terminology and definitions so we're all on the same page, because it's so easy to talk about stuff, but if you don't give a common base and reference, I think it's easy for people to give their own opinions. And let's try and work with some industry recognized concepts, ideas, to form and guide ourselves through all the fun parts we're going to look at. So that, some boring definitions and terminology, so we can just get through that. And then we're going to look at some incidents and events, and then hopefully we can learn something from that with some deeper analysis thereof, and maybe just get some insights. But first, let's just address the question. And I'm not going to try to be like a snob or anything about it. I think the term is very overused, and I think we need to understand that cyber as a concept is fine. But the etymology of cyber comes from the Greek Kubernetes, which is actually more something to do with nautical terms. And it's been adapted to our industry, the InfoSec industry, for a while now, and everybody's using cyber. But do people actually understand what they say when they say cyber, right? So, for us, we need to understand is when you talk about something, you need to be specific, because the field is very, very wide and very deep. And talking just about cyber doesn't really achieve anything, right? We need to be very specific. And that comes to another interesting thing about our industry is, I think, the field is so complex and so dense that sometimes that people get blurred by it. And just look at basic stuff, doing basic things right becomes a challenge for people, because everybody's got an opinion about stuff, and they think they're in the right track and then totally get lost, right? So for me, it's like, I think sometimes common sense falls out the window, because it is complex and you can't always apply my thought pattern, your thought pattern. We will not necessarily get the same outcome. So we need to talk about these things and we need to work through them. Right, so first up, anybody doing any InfoSec research or any InfoSec background will recognize those three concepts there. Confidentiality, integrity, availability, or continuity. It's the basis of most InfoSec, right? If you look at anything that you need to secure in our space, if you cover those three topics, you should be golden. But it seems to be that those three topics or concepts are quite difficult to actually get right, because it'll either be a hurdle, or it can a barrier, or it just never features, right? So confidentiality, secrets, keep it secret, make sure that the people that has legitimate access can read it, right? Basic concept, encryption is a good example therefore. Integrity, make sure that what I store or what I access is actually legitimate. Nobody can just change the content without actually being detected. Availability, the data that I'm protecting, the integrity that I'm ensuring, make sure that, you know, legitimate users can get access to it. Right? A good example, denial of service. Is that if you have all this stuff protected but you can't get there, there's no point, right? So use these three concepts whenever you look at these two topics. Vulnerability versus exploits. Sometimes people get it wrong, people mix them up. But what is important is to understand that vulnerabilities are being exploited, not the other way around, right? Sometimes you see people mix the concepts and so forth, right? But it's important to understand that vulnerabilities exist because of flaws, mistakes, etc. They don't necessarily get put there by bad people, but there are chances or times when that actually happens. But most of the time, people discover vulnerabilities, exploit it to gain other avenues that they explore, and then wreak havoc. All right. So, Microsoft's got an interesting definition about vulnerabilities. It reads a bit like a legal disclaimer or a warranty, but they claim it's not. But it's important to note, though, that they have some merits in what they say. So for them to, before they consider a vulnerability, it must be a reproducible problem. So in most software development, like most companies these days do, if you have any kind of bug or QA or whatever program, you need to be able to say, how did you find the problem? Can you reproduce it? Because a once-off problem is not necessarily a vulnerability. Also, it needs to meet their definition of a security vulnerability, which we'll get to. But also importantly, does the affected product security policy, is it broken? Or is the security boundary breached? And that's an interesting one that they require to get clarification on for a vulnerability. So let's see what they say. So security vulnerability is a weakness in a product that could allow an attacker to compromise the integrity, availability, or confidentiality of their product. So topics we cover, but let's break that down. What do they, let's break that down. So basically a weakness, what do they say? So a weakness, they say, it's an inadvertent weakness or working as intended. That's quite a subtlety there, right? Good example is, so inadvertent weakness versus working as intended. Working as intended, if they implemented a RC4 cipher or 40-bit cipher, and that's according to spec and requirement, it's working as intended. Nobody might agree that it's broken or it's required, but people don't like 40-bit ciphers. We've proven that. But it's according to spec, it's according to the requirement. But if you have a 256-bit cipher, and it's the implementation is throwing away half of the bits, that's a weakness, all right? So that's good. It's a good point of measure. In the product, so what do they define as a product? So is it a problem in the product, or is it a widely accepted standard? So for example, if you have an FTP implementation, FTP by default, standard FTP implementation is clear text credentials. So is that a security flaw? No, it's the actual implementation. We just don't agree with it because it's clear text everything over the internet. But if you have an SSL or TLS implementation that actually divulge sensitive information, that is a vulnerability, right? So it's important to understand that concept or that juxtaposed. Next is the trustworthiness. So could it allow an attacker to compromise the integrity thereof? So if you have, for example, an administrator that can change permission on a file, well, that's an administrator. He's got privileges to do that. He's already in that. He can change privileges of a file. But if you have an untrusted or unauthenticated user that can change privileges to a file that he doesn't have privileges to, that is a vulnerability. All right. So that is an important concern or point to observe. Next is the availability. Is the possibility to access a resource or exploit denying appropriate user to access it. So for instance, if you were to look at a service that actually have a web server, for instance. This is a good example. So anybody can access a web server, right, depending on where you're accessing the web server versus actually preventing somebody from getting to that web server. Simple concept, but it's important to designate whether it is a vulnerability in software, but if it's an external party blocking you. So it's not Microsoft's fault that somebody's denied servicing, right? Then confidentiality, limited access to information to authorized people, or versus exploit weakness in a product or non-public information. So, although some of these weaknesses can be benign, but this is an interesting example that I give, is once again a file service or a web server that actually shows you the location of a file versus you having the right to view the contents of the file. The one viewing the file, which is private information, can be constituted as a vulnerability versus just disclosing that they consider disclosing the information of the location is not necessarily vulnerability. Right. And then security boundary, that's the last part that they actually, a little caveat they put in here. Assumptions about how it will be used and promises it makes about the security provided. A good example they give is UAC, for instance. An administrator that executes something, and then there's the UAC would normally just give a consent prompt. If some vulnerability was present to not show the consent prompt, that's technically, according to their definition, not a vulnerability. But if a unprivileged or lower privileged person gets prompted with the UAC, then have to give the privileges to actually execute at a higher privilege level. If that process was bypassed, that is a vulnerability. Right. So it's a bit grayish. Sometimes this security boundary has been relaxed depending on the vulnerability that they looked at. But this is something that they use to define a vulnerability in their eyes. Other ways of looking at vulnerabilities or discovering vulnerabilities, I think some of us have looked at this OWASP top 10, recently updated. Types of vulnerabilities, more likely. Injection, broken, authentication, etc. Typically in a web application. Can also be present in other types of application, but typically web application. Then if you're really bored, go look at the MITRE common weakness enumeration. There are 716 of them. Somebody has done the effort of actually mapping some of these onto that. But yeah, it's actually quite extensive. Then they've got classifications and categories as well, or views and categories. That makes up a total of 995. But that's just too much. Right?
Is that asterisk for?
That's the views and the categories.
Okay.
So there's another, if you do the math, in total it adds up to 995. But those weaknesses are the ones that you can look at. But these are other ways of discovering or classifying vulnerabilities. Not as extensive as the Microsoft one, but more as a communication to people of how to fix bugs, right? But then we get into the one I find interesting, which is a bit more practical. It maps better to the general organization. It's a Center for Internet Security. They've got 20 controls, and they've broken it up into 3 parts. Basic controls, fundamental controls, and organizational controls. And for me, I think it's important to get these 6 right. Which is also classified as the basic controls. So, for you to protect your network and to understand where you are vulnerable, if you don't know all your hardware assets, if you don't know, in other words, your infrastructure, you don't know your software assets, what software is running where, how are you actually going to know what to do? How do you know if you've got a grip on everything? Right? Vulnerability management. Without the first 2, how are you going to execute vulnerability management? You can actually add the rapid patch management as one aspect there, right? How do you know what to fix? If there's a vulnerability that comes up, NS17-010 came out last year. Big thing, we'll talk about it now, but Microsoft actually publicly released patches for XP in that one. If you don't even know you're running an XP box, how do you know you're going to patch it against what we'll talk about now? And it's not just that, it's obscure stuff. There's some concept called shadow IT, where, I don't know if some of you have heard of it, but basically it's, if you're a system administrator or an IT manager, depending on how much privileges your client, your staff have, you don't know what software they've installed on there. You know, they want this little screen grabber thingy there, they want this little funny thing over there. You've just exposed yourself inadvertently to some supply chain attack, perhaps. You don't know they're running some dodgy stuff. And that is comes down to this. Know yourself, know what you're actually up for. And that comes to the next point, controlled use of administrative privileges. Concept of least privilege. I don't know if you've heard of that, but which means is you don't always need to be an administrator. The services don't have to run as NT system. It doesn't have to run as root if you're running Linux. Give them the bare minimum, lock it down, but it's difficult, it's hard, right? It's not straightforward. Then secure configuration for hardware, software, mobile devices, laptops, workstations. What that means is basically file integrity monitoring, encrypted, full disk encryption, all these fancy stuff, right? If somebody plugs in a USB device, is that USB device authorized, stuff like that. Who's got access to plugging in and swapping out network cables in the data center. Do you know that that event happened? Monitoring and maintenance, for instance. Do you know somebody fiddled with your router, did the box reboot? If you're concerned about SLA and uptimes, you'll definitely hear about your box rebooted without scheduled downtime. But if you're not concerned about those things, how are you going to know about it, right? So getting these things right, maintenance, monitoring, and analysis of logs. I think many people miss that point because in today's landscape, post-exploitation, you're not even going to know you're breached or how you were breached, right? You can't protect against everything, but when it happens, make sure you can detect it and you can actually understand how it happened. And later on you can see what the impact thereof is. I think many people don't realize about that because they don't even know what they are protecting, right? Next point. Foundational controls. Think this is all IT 101 to most of us, right? We've all seen these things, we've all heard of these things. Malware defenses, what's that? Data recovery. And I think this is very, for me, it's important, data recovery. Many times you've heard backup, backup, backup. I don't care about your backup. Show me your data recovery, your restoration process. When last did you test your data recovery? Are you actually just backing up random bits, or you actually got something reusable? Because if that, and then this comes down to data. What is it now? Data recovery. That comes down to your data availability. If something breaks, and remember, we're talking now about actual incidents, but vulnerabilities or that confidentiality, integrity, and availability is not necessarily bad guys breaking into your environment. It's environmental, temporal, all these things. Server room gets flooded, UPS backs up, whatever. And you need to be able to recover from those things.
It's easier to solve that these days thanks to ransomware though.
that
being honest about this, the city of Atlanta just got hit recently, and they were going to pay $55,000 US because because they worked out the cost of doing everything over again cost them $2 million versus $55,000.
They've already spent 2.6. We'll get to that now.
And they were too late, so they can't actually recover.
Yeah, it's scary, but we'll see that now. But yeah, it's ridiculous how some of these things work, and it's basic IT 101, right? Secure configuration, network devices, firewalls, routers. I don't know if any of you guys run Cisco or have actually got to do with Cisco, but there's something called Smart Install, right? Now, this is a management interface with no authentication on it, which is exposed to the internet.
Not so smart.
Then, yeah.
Not so smart.
But then that's not a problem because you still need to be able to access you still have to be able to find out where the config files is, but the SNMP is sometimes open as well. So you just query your community strings, get that, then use TFTP to quickly just get the file off, modify it and upload it again. There were one stage 150,000 devices out there, known devices with this open, right? This is common basic stuff. And the sad thing is this is on switches and stuff like that. So is this a failing of the vendor or is this a failing of the deployment? Right, I don't know. But these things happen. It's unfortunate. More controls, boundary defenses, data protection. So data protection is knowing that data actually leaves your network, enters your network, and where it is. GDPR, a month from now, good luck with that. But that's reality. People don't even know employees are mailing stuff out of their business. there are ways of dealing with this, and it's not difficult. It's just people need to do it. Most of the time, I think it's people see this list and like panic, but just eat this elephant one bit at a time. Wireless access control, I think, is quite an important thing, because people want wireless. People think wireless is a constitutional right? But we've become so used to that ever connected thing. It's a luxury. But no, we need to lock that down. It's dangerous what people can do. Trojans now jumping from Android to PC. That's a new thing, right? Download your compromised Pokemon Go app, and the next thing you know, your Windows is doing coin Monero mining. And once again, account monitoring control. Why are people being added at 12 o'clock at night to the domain controller list administrator? Why is this employee that left 2 months ago and all of a sudden RDPing into the box, besides the fact that why do we have still his VPN credentials open, stuff like that? I mean, this is important, and I think this is sometimes a very overlooked point in some organizations, especially smaller organizations, which doesn't have a lot of IT savvy. And then the next thing, I think some of it is quite interesting. And this list is also, not just this point, but this whole list is all about organization maturity. I think it's about aspiring to get this. Don't necessarily, you have to do everything right, aspire to do these things. But implementation of security awareness and training, that sometimes gets sold as a silver bullet, but it's not. You'll still have people doing stupid things. People will still click on links that comes in the mail from somewhere they don't know, or in their defense, it's a very well put together phishing mail. You get really well crafted ones. But I think the more important people need to understand how to respond when they realize something went wrong. Don't try and hide the stuff. It's all about understanding. People need to understand impact more than they actually understand security. All right, and then that point, number 19, incident response and management. It's a very overlooked point. When the pawpaw hits the fan, all right, what are you going to do? Do you still have to think about it, etc.? Make sure that you have a plan up front before it happens, and execute that plan often. It's a fire drill. But anyway, all right. Any questions up to this point? Statements? It's a lot of information.
I'll just add one thing. This is all covered in ISO 27000 alignment and certification. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts around that. The process of becoming aligned.
So the company I'm working for, the UK company is ISO 27001. The South African based one is busy going through that now. So what makes the South African company unique is it's actually a bunch of hackers. How do you ISO 27001, how do you get those guys to comply to those standards? It's a very difficult question because those people work with different environments. But it's good in one way only. It's if you make that compliance not a bureaucratic red tape, but you make it so that actually the company can benefit from it. The reason why I'm saying it, there's a ton of documentation. And the documentation referring to paragraph of documentation referring to other. And it's not just one department, it's HR, it is finance, it is your IT people, it is whoever other organization units in there that needs to each have their set of compliance policies and rules. What is good, what that document is good for, is definitely when it shows to, what I looked at it, is it removes the dependency on individuals, which is quite a good thing because people go and leave, people get sick, people go to other companies, whatever, and sometimes that knowledge evaporates with those people. That's the plan, and part of the ISO documentation. So that's a laborious thing. It's not every organization can do that. I mean, it makes PCI look like a picnic, but this is part of that. Incident response is part of that. So compliance is a pain. And unfortunately, if you want to do business these days, you have to fill in some of those things. And Well, the good thing about it is what the IT manager said to me is that he hates the documentation now. But once he's done with the documentation, next time there's a tender, there's a quote that's got to go out, he just attaches his ISO 27100 documentation. He doesn't have to fill in a questionnaire of 200 to 300 questions for a tender. Because he's just like, why do you have to answer your questions? Here's my proof. Go read.
Well, I can second that because I'm literally in charge of ISO 27000 certification right now. So all this shit that you're talking about is horrible and I have to deal with it. And it's for the exact reason. We've had partners who we're dealing with some very big companies, which I can't name at this point, but they've asked that exact question. And there's these huge vendor security assessments you have to go through. And that by itself is a lot of work. So then one of the first questions they ask, are you ISO certified or are you some other related certification or similar that you can just...
Yeah, and what sometimes get lost in this whole process is that if you do that effort up front now and right, you maintain that documentation, it makes your life easier down the road. Now it's pain. Look, red tape and those things are nasty, but if it's done for the right reasons and people understand the value to it.
So with ISO, from our side, because we've gone through the ISO process, is if you look at, if you go by the guides of ISO 27002, you're going to change a lot in your company, and it's going to destroy your company. But if you take it from a side where you understand the 27001, and then morph the 27001 to comply with the way you work, you'll find people will actually like will enjoy the process of taking on the standard itself. So if you have good practice, most people are quite security safe in a certain way. But it's just now you're informing them, okay, with this, we're doing this for this reason. But most people tend to go the 27002 route because it's the quickest way. You're going through a checklist. But going through a checklist, when you're done with it, you throw that piece of paper behind you, but you're still sitting in a company that's full of holes.
And that's why I say do it for the right reasons. Yeah. Shortcuts is questionable because big companies that supposedly, supposed to put forward a good posture, just get ripped, right? So next thing, let's get to the juicy stuff. This is one that stands out for me, and I think not necessarily because of the media hype it received, because I think it was overhyped, but because it ticks many of the boxes, well, it doesn't tick many of the boxes that we looked at earlier. The final figure that they gave was almost 148 million records. And they came to that conclusion dribs and drabs because they didn't even know what data was stolen in the beginning. There was just like this thumbs up, guessing, eventually grew. So they were compromised roughly in May, so almost a year ago. Data breach was only discovered in July. And then the shocking thing for me that I didn't put there is they only really started formulating the plan here from after a board meeting they had in August. But then they took a month before they actually did the actual public address. And in the public address even they screwed up stuff, right? Their incident response plan or their PR plan on the incident response plan, for which they never even understood they had to do, they screwed up. And it was a simple multi-part parser remote code execution bug that was disclosed in March. And the PR disaster of the whole thing was a problem. And this is the thing you don't want to see when your CEO or your former CEO starts blaming staff. All right. Yes, maybe the guy screwed up, but actually the organization screwed up, because how did you allow that guy to screw up? My point. And that's why I think this whole thing was a problem, because lots of people lost their jobs for this, but they lost it for the wrong reasons, because of simple mistakes. Also, when that supposed, critical vulnerability happened, which there was a patch for, because the IT staffer didn't scan and didn't notify people he didn't scan, the data was unrestricted when they breached that box, or the access to the data. It wasn't even encrypted. Data at rest was just in the clear right there to be taken. So there were talks about PGP keys and stuff lying around there, but the PGP keys, the private keys were lying there also. And then they had the Argentinian branch that just had administrative password in there. So it's a systemic problem in the organization. So later down the line, through this whole Equifax security